The floor is yours. Grazie. Have a great work.
Grazie, Ambassador. It's very nice to be back at the embassy among friends. And thank you to the embassy and the UN Foundation. I think this discussion that we're having today about the global goals really dovetails with the embassy's and the foundation's digital diplomacy series, which I think is so important for getting the message of development and diplomacy out there. And there are so many new ways and exciting ways that the series is addressing. So today is just one of the amazing topics that they're discussing, and I'm glad to be part of it. I'd like to just briefly introduce our distinguished panel, who has a lot of experience and also insights on talking about the global goals and how we use technology and social media to advance these goals. As Amina Mohammed, as we know, is the Secretary General's Special Advisor on post-2015 development planning, really one of the masterminds behind the new development agenda passed this week in New York. Ms. Mohammed was previously senior special assistant to the President of Nigeria on the Millennium Development Goals after serving 3 presidents in Nigeria over 6 years. So I think it's really great that she'll be able to talk both from implementing the goals on the ground and also about passing these new ones. Ambassador Elizabeth Cousens is also the Deputy CEO of the UN Foundation, former US Ambassador to the UN Economic and Social Council, an alternative US representative to the UN General Assembly, ECOSOC as it's famously known, where she also led diplomacy and negotiations on development for the US, climate, human rights, peacekeeping, and humanitarian issues at the UN, and really has spearheaded US policy efforts until she joined the UN Foundation on the post-2015 development agenda. And Tara Sonenshine, my former colleague at the State Department, is a former Shapiro Fellow and Distinguished Fellow at George Washington's University School of Media and Public Affairs. I got to know her as the former Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs at the Department of State. She was also the Executive Vice President at USIP and a fellow former journalist at ABC News. So we couldn't have a more distinguished panel to talk about the 2015 global goals, how they differ from the Millennium Goals 15 years ago, and how we move forward and leverage social media and technology to not only get the word out about the goals, but also using these technologies to help advance them. So Amina, let's start with the global goals that are replacing the 2000 Millennium Development Goals launched by the UN 15 years ago. Let's talk about how they differ.
Right, and they're the Sustainable Development Goals. I think for us, the difference has been, first, that it's a universal agenda. It's about everyone. When we did the MDGs, it really was about just a part of the world that suffered most from the poverty, and it was a social agenda. The second is that it's integrated. We're talking about not just the social pillar, but the economic one and the environmental one, knowing that we can't just do this looking at health without seeing how our economies grow and have the necessary investments that we need to make sure health systems work. And we can't ignore anymore what is happening in the environment. So it's universal, it's integrated. It is looking at addressing root causes. I think that's a major difference from what happened with the MDGs. Over 15 years again, and again, that time frame I think is important, because it wasn't always a done deal to say that we would do that. There was some who even thought it could just be a 5-year thing. So over time, universal, builds on the MDGs, knowing that they're not finished, they're unfinished business. That's it.
So we look at these 17 goals, no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, but also sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption. How realistic is it by 2030 or even longer that we can actually check these goals off, or is it just a commitment really to get as far as we can on these goals?
I think the way and the process that sort of evolved that we got these 17 goals was really a response to the challenges existing and emerging that we have. So I think by 2030, these goals are doable. I think it's a big agenda, but then again, the problems are quite big too. The crises that we have and a number of the issues that we were speaking to are resolved in these 17 responses, investments that we need to make. But first, by finishing the MDGs, the first 6 really respond to that, but they go a little bit further. Certainly on health, we're not just talking about the 3 issues that we had in the terms of the diseases of malaria, tuberculosis, and HIV. They're still there, but not in the same way. Maternal health is still a big issue, and so too is child health. But we've gone further to address non-communicable diseases and in a universal agenda, speed them up. The middle part of it, of course, is very important. That's really where it matters, is how are we going to grow the economies that we need to? How do we have the transformations that we need to address the issues?
And I think, as you said, it's integrated. And so one, if you can improve on one, that begets a lot of the others. So I think as you improve upon some of them, other ones will also. Just lastly, talk about the whole idea of sustainability. I mean, when we first started talking about, maybe 20 years ago, the word sustainable got on. It kind of, people took that very literally to mean it kind of is able to sustain itself. But talk about what sustainability really means in terms of implementing these goals.
I think when we speak about sustainability, it's about the investments that we make in this as a whole that are essentially irreversible. So
not a quick fix.
Not a quick fix. And we've said no more Band-Aids. It's about the root cause. If we're going to put down primary healthcare centers that are going to deal with health, they've got to have water and power and infrastructure. And then they've got to have a budget that is able to take care of it from domestic resources, investments that will perhaps bring other infrastructure in to help it. But it is really about making sure that what we put down is something that a country itself has an economy that can sustain it. And to do that, we will need the partnerships to get to where we need to get to.
So Elizabeth, we have these 17 new goals. Let's look back a little bit about how we met the old ones and what puts us in a better position now to be able to implement this very formidable list.
Well, thanks, Elise, and it's great to be here with all of you and always to be here with Amina. A couple of things I would say. First, we learned an enormous amount about development during the process of the Millennium Development Goals. We learned about how you produce outcomes. We learned about how you sustain outcomes. And all of that data, evidence, learning informed the early and sustained conversations that were involved in crafting this framework. That's the first thing. Second, we've seen a real shift, I think, in how we think about how you invest in development. So we started from a conversation in 2000 that was really about official development assistance. We have now comprehensively opened the aperture to be looking at all forms of investment in development, the resources, the ideas, the people, the technologies that you can mobilize to produce development outcomes. And that's kind of a second major shift in how we're thinking about solutions, and it will allow us, I think, to have more enduring impact.
And also, I mean, the world has changed so much since 2000. I mean, we're going to get into the, kind of social media and digital diplomacy aspects. But when you look at the world now versus when we were working on these development goals, these millennial goals in 2000, it just seems as if we're looking at a whole new landscape with more opportunities to leverage.
Well, the world has clearly changed in all kinds of ways, but the process that got us here also was comprehensively different than anything we'd done before. I've been around the UN in various capacities over the last 20 odd years. I have never seen a UN process this inclusive and this genuinely inclusive. So every country deeply involved, deeply invested in the discussion, the debate, their issues, what mattered to them. Millions of citizens around the world who were mobilized, engaged, consulted. The scientific community, the business community had a very different voice and presence in these conversations. It was just a very different type of debate and conversation that generated the framework that was agreed a couple of weeks ago.
And also, I used to cover the United Nations, and I noticed that this time, public diplomacy, and we'll get to Tara to talk about that from a U.S. perspective, but it seems as if the UN Department of Public Information was kind of brought in earlier on, as opposed to, here's our agenda, market it.
I think, and there are colleagues here in the room who are from the Department of Public Information, DPI. Thank you. You saw, I think, an early recognition that what would really enable this agenda and also make it more authentic was genuine engagement with publics. so that public information, engagement, consultation was hardwired into the process and the outcome in a very different way. And I think you saw a sustained investment by the UN, by partners, by any number of colleagues who really recognized the value of that kind of public engagement throughout.
Tara, let's pick up on that. I mean, about how the world has changed since 2000 in the kind of technological and the public diplomacy field, this explosion of not only, social media, and we like to reduce it to talking about, Twitter, but, the technologies themselves have just exploded and given so many more, opportunities here.
Absolutely, and let me begin by thanking the ambassador and the embassy, and also taking note of these 4 women on a panel on discussing something that has gender and equality is really very, very exciting. The world, as Elise, you mentioned, has changed not only in technology, and we all know social media and the web, but we also now have power vested with people in a different way. And we saw in the breakdown of states and nation states that we are very segmented in the world. And you can look at it as a positive or a negative. I tend to look at it as an is. So you have people empowered in new and different ways, which is a change from the triangle. I always think about the old triangle. You had leadership on top, and you had a base of publics. What we've done is flip the triangle. So publics are often driving at the top the agenda, and we come down to leadership and authority at the tip. But there are 2 specific ways that digital diplomacy and digital media intersect with these sustainability goals. One is that you can't have development and sustainability without information technology. Simply cannot. And when you look at the statistics, how many in this room have a mobile phone with them right now? So we think that's a kind of elite audience, but if you were to go out and ask in the world, how many people right now are carrying a mobile phone? The number is 3 billion. 3 billion. If you try to project that out, the number of people who will have a mobile device in 5 years will be 7.7 billion. And about 80% of those are going to be in Africa and Asia. So one is you can't really talk about sustainability and development without talking about the information technology and revolution. The second is you can't reach people with a message to be involved in this if you're not communicating in some way with people. And I have to say the UN does deserve a lot of credit on this round because they have been out. Amina has done more outreach probably in the last month than in a very long time. And she has to go out and explain and define and involve and engage a diverse audience of people in this whole sustainability movement. So on both of those, I think the digital folks are going to have to be at the table, and we will be at the table.
Talk to me a little bit about the role of the citizen here and how social media has kind of informed the public debate. Because, I mean, as we know, the internet was just at its infancy, really, in 2000.
Well, firstly, I don't think this is a matter of whether this is a good or a bad. Again, it is and is. By which I mean people are tweeting and they're on Facebook. And by and large, even where there's still a digital divide, and let us not pretend there is still not a digital divide with people not wired, for the most part, this engine of change has now gotten into people's hands. I will tell you where it has not penetrated as deeply, and that's for women. When you look at the users of this technology, women are still left out in many places from this piece of the sustainability pie. And what I'm particularly happy about is that women and girls have really gotten into the sustainability debate and discussion. Without half the sky, we will not achieve those 17 development sustainability goals. So I think that's a piece we just have to keep working at and get them wired in, or they're not going to be at the digital table.
Amina, you were mentioning before we started about how the new technology landscape and social media has made you kind of talk to people about how to explain these goals. It's made them actually crystallize, when you boil it down to a tweet, for instance. Talk a little bit about that.
Yes, absolutely. One of the things we tried to do, and a lesson learned from the MDGs, is this lack of ownership, and we wanted to make sure everyone owned, at least knew about them. But communicating a story or getting a complicated name like Sustainable Development Goals, which most people are allergic to. Global goals was part of the partnerships we had. So we'd say, okay, the Sustainable Development Goals, those are the global goals to achieve sustainable development, but you just take out the middle. The first, I think, interaction with young people on this was social media, asking a set of questions about the world they wanted. What sort of input would we get? What would be the set of priorities? And then around 16 different levels of questions went in there. Remarkably, across the world, the first 4 were the same: education, health, jobs, responsible government. And it was quite amazing when you saw that come back. So we knew that when we were informing member states and what to do with that, it was easy to address it. But the interesting thing about it was we were addressing a universal agenda. And when our team broke this down and said to me, we can tell you country by country, disaggregated data by the age of those that have responded, whether they're female or male. And so you can have a look at this. So I went to have a look, and I sort of pressed on Sweden and a couple of northern countries. And then up came this data that they thought the most important thing was water and sanitation. And things that I thought, well, I know that Sweden doesn't have a water and sanitation problem. What is this? And the mindset hadn't changed. We hadn't communicated universality. So this is about what they thought was needed in the world and was important. And they cared about water and sanitation for the poor, for India, for Africa.
How do you boil down water and sanitation for the poor to 140 characters, for instance?
Open defecation. I think, we learned over time how to do that. And I think it was, how do you say universality and communicate it? Leave no one behind. How were you speaking about what's the difference of this? I'd say, well, this is about root causes and not a Band-Aid on development. And you get that into the tweet. So, it really was a conscious effort to try to say that don't start giving a long story. How do you just...
Now, it's interesting because you started from your previous position of implementing the Millennium Goals in Nigeria. And how does it differ when you're trying to get people, Nigerians involved in their own development that they want for their country versus trying to sell these 17 goals to a global audience?
I think communicating what it is that we wanted to do and addressing issues that matter to everyone. I think the global issues, everyone understood that migration and conflict and climate change, young people are way ahead knowing that those things matter to everyone. So a response to that and using social media was quite incredible. Think of the 8 million responses that we got for the platform on The World You Want. Almost 2 million came from Nigeria. And so in effect, really, the world is much closer than we think, and technology brings you even closer. So you'd be surprised the level of interaction from people in Kenya, for instance, on mobile telephones, on the internet. And again, the same sort of issues coming in a resonance. And what we did very early on was create these coalitions as well for civil society. Again, mostly young people coming together to discuss these issues and feedback.
Elizabeth, you went from negotiating the goals and defending the U.S. position to now being outside of the government, trying to influence the outcome. So how does getting people involved and leveraging these technologies and getting a message help you with your being able to leverage your influence in just helping decide the outcomes?
Well, I think I think where everybody is now, having done all of this work to launch this framework and get it adopted, people are now thinking about the day after, what comes next. We've created this colossal historic opportunity in this agenda that we've just seen agreed. But now what matters is what we decide to do about it. So people are beginning to pivot to actions, to implementation, to investments. What do you need? How do you need to organize? In what timeframes? What's going to happen at the country level? What would happen at the global level? And we need technology, we need mobilization, we need sustained attention in every respect. And I think, we see everything from data to communication technology as an absolutely critical enabler of those conversations about the learning that has to happen. I think in almost any domain of implementation, one has to learn from experience. And so we're going to have to kind of wire into our culture and our practice over the next 15 years. What are we learning from different contexts and communities about how we get this job done? How do we adapt? How do we build the data systems to propel it, to data to propel solutions, et cetera?
Because it's not only the message you get out on the technology piece, but the technologies themselves, it seems.
Exactly. It's not just the medium driving the message. It's this data concept being interwoven into everything we do. Example, if you're trying to prevent conflict, you need the mapping technologies, the big data, the information that tells you what's boiling up in a society. If you're in the middle of conflict and you're working on conflict mitigation, again, without information, you are working in the dark, literally. And I keep reinforcing to people, information is the oxygen with which a society breathes. So you can't have an ill-informed, misinformed society participating productively in a whole of sustainability goal. And the third is post-conflict. We see refugees now. That data is important even in a case where you're really talking about food and water. How do you find people? How do you map where they're going? How do you reconnect people as they migrate? The social mobility part of social media is the most fascinating concentric piece, because you have people moving at the same time that you have information moving. So you have this confluence of science, technology, innovation, data, social media, all moving at the same time that human beings are moving. What a conundrum to have to then figure out how you're going to move them along a productive, prosperous, anti-poverty path.
Amina, talk about the role of civil society here and the idea that it seems that when you came in, you also brought in a lot of people to kind of work on NGOs and celebrities and private-public partnerships. It seems as if even more today, that's so much more relevant and important than it was in 2000.
Yeah, again, ownership of this agenda, and really not just a consultation, but part of the whole, we are going to shape it and we're going to implement it and we're going to hold to account was important. And we didn't have this at the beginning with the MDGs, and it was a real lesson learned for even the implementation of the MDGs. So bringing in the different constituencies to a universal agenda was not as easy as we thought, because the usual suspects were always there. You had to broaden the constituency for civil society that was dealing with different issues now, because we were going beyond just the social agenda. We were also dealing with different communities, those from the islands, the Pacific Islands. I have to say, we visited the smallest member of our family, because we kept saying, leave no one behind. And you get to that island and they've got a set of issues that you cannot imagine. Where over 90% obesity, over 90% of 5% of them with diabetes type A, and they're 4 hours off the coast of Australia. You can't see them, so why would they matter? So really important that their representation was around to be part of this discussion, so their issues could be taken, and we would be able to count them in. Then we had new players that really need to make this agenda work. It's a bigger one. Business. How do we talk to business? Business coming into the room, we had to contain civil society that had very little trust with business, And yet we knew they were a central part of this. A language that they didn't speak to us come into our halls in the United Nations, and it was like everything closed down. So how do we open up other spaces for them to come into? Parliamentarians, they make the laws, they provide the appropriation, yet we never had them in this conversation. The thin line between, do they get really involved in government, or, how far, where's the line drawn for them to do that? And so everybody that came into this, young people, and really engaging with them, not a sterile consultation, but really asking what the issues were and where the solutions were coming from. So last week was pleasant because we had the Solutions Summit that UNF put on with the US. And if you see the solutions that came, they've come from a lot of consultation that's opened up a space for us to go to the next step. And I think that inclusiveness has given us ownership and this urgency to what's next? How can we move to implementation?
Elizabeth, you're very big on public-private partnerships. How much is that the future?
I think there is no question but that any solution set we're looking at cannot be achieved by any one sector alone. And there's going to be a different balance in different sectors, whether it's energy solutions or it's food security or it's water and sanitation or primary education. But every sector is required in almost every context. And I think the key is, as Amina was saying, is what are the platforms that you can create to enable that kind of collaboration over time, where you're really drawing in the resources, the ideas, the people, again, over a sustained period of time around specific solutions. And I think that's part of what a framework like this gets you, because you have objectives in mind and people can actually focus on that.
Tara, last week we saw Shakira at the summit. We saw, Jennifer Lopez is on the website of the global goals. We saw videos from Stephen Hawking. How much? Don't forget the Pope. Well, I mean, he was the ultimate celebrity, right?
Mark Zuckerberg.
I mean,
well, you have lots of celebrities.
How much of this? And also, let's talk about the Pope. I mean, how much of this is, when celebrities speak out and they garner attention and they raise awareness, how much do you think this matters ultimately in advancing of the agenda? Or is it just buzz that people are talking about, but it doesn't really help on the ground, per se?
It helps in two measurable ways. First, it personalizes and individualizes something that can seem so macro and big. I mean, sustainability is a big concept. So when you attach it to an individual, a celebrity, a person, it has a sense of personality. The second thing it does is it creates storytelling. The most important piece of what social media, public diplomacy, public affairs, communications is about telling stories. And I think about in the next few months, the film Malala is coming out. Why does Malala so take off for people? One, she's a real person. She's an individual. The second is they've harnessed the power of film and social media to put the hashtag, the film, the medium, the message together. And I think part of why we attach well-known people to things is it helps us embrace this as something real that affects my life, whether it's a musician or a playwright or a film director or somebody caught up in a conflict. And frankly, if we don't have these stories and role models, we will often be driven, and I'm sure this will come up, by the extremists who tell their story, who have their own narrative, who have their own view of how the world should be. So the onus is on us to drive these messages home with real people, both in virtual ways and I think in physical ways, which is to engage in real terms with human beings.
Well, I think that's a great setup for our questions. I'm sure a lot of you are actually practitioners in the field, students working on this. Let's open up the floor to questions. If you have a question, raise your hand, and one of the embassy staff will bring a microphone. Please identify yourself and keep your questions relatively short so we can fit in as many as possible. And don't be shy. We're talking about getting information out there, so let's open up the floor. Sir.
I'm Bob Hershey. I'm a consultant. How are you doing on getting the private sector into this and getting online meetings where they're putting up funding and get an economic consensus on what they can do to help?
Right, actually, very well. This discussion has gone to a level where we're not just the UN convening, they're convening themselves. There are a couple of commissions that are coming up where they want to actually make the case for sustainable development. And they're coming from different networks to be part of this. The beginning of this year, the World Economic Forum had a lot of interest in how to make this work. Beyond that, there are initiatives that the Secretary General had started for the MDGs to accelerate trying to finish them in every woman, every child. And we've seen a huge number coming in from the business community on the second version of it that now broadens it to look at adolescence and to look at context, so humanitarian context. That alone, just in the General Assembly, and it's increasing, had a commitments of over $25 billion last week. Then we have the Sustainable Energy for All, which again is an incredibly important part of the infrastructure here that we need to transform our economies, and to see new leadership there and more engagement, helping countries to figure out what their energy mix should be, so that we can, cleaner environments, cleaner economies for it. So it's going in the right direction. It still needs a lot of work to bring the global conversation from business down to the local, particularly as we look at entrepreneurs and young people and women. So I think it's going the right way. And I don't know if you'd like to add to that, because I know the UNF and the B team have been.
No, I think that's exactly right. And I would mention two things. First, I've not seen, I think, ever the level and the seriousness of private sector engagement in these sorts of issues. Just to give an example, there was a conference in Addis Ababa this summer, which was all about how do you invest in development, financing for development, and the outpouring and physical presence of corporate leaders from every sector, and not just global corporate leaders, but also from national business leaders, small and medium enterprises, really an extraordinary richness of people who are looking at how their business models can evolve in relation to some of the trends they see in the world.
The whole social responsibility, people are building that more.
But it's also about profit. I mean, it's also about seeing trends in the world and investment opportunities, and trying to think about how you align long-term value creation in relation to some of these policy shifts that are happening. And so I think there is both a sense of responsibility, but also opportunity. And that creates a very fertile ground for engagement. And again, it will be different across sectors, health sector, transportation, energy, and so on. But I think you're seeing financial sector, you're really seeing a great and fertility in those conversations across the board in the private sector.
Well, and again, I mean, as Amina was saying, how the goals are integrated, I think as you see, progress perhaps on peace and justice and strong institutions, you may have more investment in industry, innovation, and infrastructure, because it'll be a more secure, safer investment, I suppose.
A more enabling environment. I mean, I think one part, this whole agenda has got to do with how do you bring in investments and partners that will be there for the long term. So Goal 16 matters an awful lot to us in that environment becoming a reality for people. But I think business has also looked at the business models that they have. And so it is beyond social responsibility. That's important, but it's insufficient. The discussion on the resources needed for this, business in the insurance companies, for instance, we thought they had a certain amount of resources to unlock that we wanted to grab to bring into health, to bring into different parts of this agenda, only to find that when you really engage them with that, they said, actually, we've got a lot more and we could do something with this. We understand these 17 goals. And they had been really good on the climate change. On a number of the disaster risk mitigation issues. But when they came to this agenda, they knew what to do, but it was about scale and unlocking a lot of the resources that we talked about. So we are learning every day. I think the Commission for Sustainable Development is going to open up so many more opportunities.
And let me make this very real for a moment about corporate, because you're looking for the hyphen between private and public. What's the sweet spot that is going to create a shared agenda around a corporation that is got a bottom line interest and the public sector, which has a different bottom line? I've seen this now take off in the chocolate industry, which we've talked about. If you are a manufacturer, if you are Mars or Nestle or Godiva, you can pick any chocolate company, You are reliant on cocoa farmers in Cote d'Ivoire, in Ghana. You need supply. And if you have farmers that don't have the best technology, don't have the best science, women farmers deprived of that, you as a manufacturer of that good can no longer rely on that crop. I mean, these are dollars and cents kinds of issues. If you're looking at a market for young consumers for your product, you can be sure you are looking at Asia and Africa and how the youth bulge, which is really a youth opportunity. You want to sell to those young people. But if those young people are not in a sustained mode, you can't have a sustainable investment.
Well, let's turn that around to the opposite of that. And how do you kind of get the chocolate company on the mindset that, and how do you get the public in the mindset that I'm going to patron companies that are working on, in a sustainable way and are investing in countries and not just pilfering the resources? And how do you leverage social media to buy Nestle as opposed to Cadbury because they're a more responsible company?
We don't have to. The public is doing it for us. The consumer is driving this debate. They're saying, I want to know the ingredients of foods. I want to know where things come from. We have to now respond to pent-up emotion that is coming from the public sector, I think, without imposing upon them any rules. I don't know if in your work you've seen that, but there is a social responsibility out there in the public commons that you don't have to turn it on.
Yep, I think there's also a very big debate around decent work. When you saw decent work there, and we see the target there that talks about trafficking and the number of disasters that the media has been able to reflect for us when we see factory workers and the building coming down on them. The brand for business now is affected by the way in which you treat your people and what you do. So that, I think, is illustrated in this agenda. And I think that we are seeing that with social media, it's becoming the checklist for it. And you're finding more and more platforms that are checking you out. I think Oxfam has one on businesses, which it relates to. So it is affecting their brand. They're very conscious of that. We have two sort of different sets, one that recognized that in Brazil, who said, when we tried to talk about how do we change and be more responsive to our clients, it was actually people within the company, a family business, that said, let's start talking about this, and started to think about their day job as part of their life. It's not something they thought about for the weekend, and it's a job I go do as a hobby with an NGO. No, it became about how does that affect us in the work that we do, and we take out and we bring this synergy. We're not a different person at work as we are when we're at home in the society and what happens there. And an interesting reflection from one businessman, very successful business, and he said, if you want us to come into this agenda, please don't tell me about poor people and poverty, because I'm thinking about my bottom line, and I thought, this is dreadful. How do we convince this person? But he was being honest about it. And then he said, but if you talk about my daughter and the effect this will all have on her life, then you've touched a nerve. And so it is also about, with a non-legally binding agreement, how do you get hold of people's hearts and minds? How does it become a moral imperative that you've got to wake up and really think about your actions and what happens to others? The smoking ban, for instance, when people said you were not allowed to smoke, you didn't care very much until someone said, your smoking will affect the baby that I'm about to have. And suddenly there was that consciousness that I can actually affect you negatively and in bad ways.
And that's how those stories, Tara, you were talking about fit into it. Are there any other questions? Okay, great. Let's go right here, and then we'll go to the end of the row right here.
Thank you. My name is Ed Almodar from the UN Association. I wanted to pursue further the issue of implementation, both around the world as well as within the US. Around the world, I'd like to hear more about what the UN is doing to help other countries on costing, financing, and implementation of the goals. And then within the US, I'd like to hear more about how this is likely to play out both within the Obama administration as well as beyond. Are we at risk of having images that we had from Agenda 21 and black helicopters of the UN telling the US what we should do, and getting all of that backlash? How can we manage that? Thank you.
Okay, well, Amina, why don't you start and then maybe Elizabeth.
Okay, I'll do the international bit. The black helicopters I'll leave alone. But I will say that this has been a decision, this has been a framework that the US have helped to frame as well. So no one's telling anyone what to do. It's a collective agreement of what needs to be done globally. But what the UN is doing, and has been thinking about this for a couple of years, we have to be fit for purpose. This agenda is different. And so therefore the skill sets and the structures and the response to this at the country level will need to be different. And how they go about doing that is in a frame that they're now working on, so an implementation strategy to tell us exactly how they will support this as country teams with bigger partnerships, with a much more coordination and coherence around the international community that is at the country level. Not just the UN, there are donors there, the EU is there, the World Bank, everyone is in one way or another at the country level. How do we facilitate this? I think there's a very clear message that the SDGs should inform countries' plans and their visions. This is about a 2030 agenda, lifting that up and seeing the SDGs as the ambition that you may or may not have in your plans, but not to have a plan by the side that says this is the SDG plan for Nigeria, for instance. But if I have a Vision 2020, as we do in my country, what is Vision 2030? How do these inform them? And how can the UN provide that convening space so that the different stakeholders can come along and help to do that? So that's ongoing now as we speak. There's still a part of this agenda that's undone, and that's the indicator work to measure this and hold persons accountable, different roles and responsibilities. And that's a discussion that has to happen at the country level. Ultimately, that's where this is going to be driven, and the UN in facilitation mode.
So just on the U.S. side, I'd say a couple of things. First, from a very early period, the U.S. saw this whole conversation as an opportunity first to reinforce really what were the priorities and how the U.S. thought about development overall. So to think about root causes, about the drivers of outcomes, to think about governance, about inclusive economic growth, et cetera, about inequality issues is the first thing. But the second thing is that part of why this whole framework came to be is that every country sees themselves in it. Mm-hmm. So it's not as though it comes from someplace and then you figure out how to implement it at home. What shapes the whole thing to begin with is that you have issues at home and in the world. So for the United States, if you take the first goal, which is about poverty, yes, it's eliminate extreme poverty. And that's something that President Obama called for a few years ago, as people will recall in his State of the Union address. It also calls for lifting people above their respective national poverty floors. That's a proud commitment that in a bipartisan sense you can endorse and embrace in the United States as in any country. Health issues, education issues, it's not as though those aren't things that people are thinking about all the time. So this framework is a way of actually helping advance issues and priorities that many countries are already thinking about struggling with, violence in societies. The United States last week had a special event on Goal 16, which is the governance, justice, and peace goal. And it was primarily about a domestic access to justice issue. So a huge priority for this administration, and therefore this is an opportunity to help advance it.
But Tara, it does seem as if when you look at this list and you look at the US, people around the world would say, oh, well, these don't apply to the United States. Everything's fine there.
Well, firstly, if you go out across college campuses in the US, you will find students embracing elements of this, and they are not as caught up in the old US, UN divides. They want to get something done on climate change. And they're very focused on some of these goals without the baggage that I think a lot of us brought to some of these issues. The second thing is that the measurable outcomes around science and technology and STEM in here, if you're going to solve health problems, you're going to do that with science, technology, innovation, data exchanges on vaccines, disease outcomes. These are very real things. And I think the politics, at least even in the US, except in Washington, and I think we're seeing a revolt against our fixation on some of the politics around these issues. There's a little bit of impatience out there with those of us who are ground down in the politics of the United Nations and member states. So it's interesting. We are catching up with the public constantly in this.
Okay, if you have a question, raise your hand. Okay, we'll go here, and then we're going to go to this gentleman, and then into the back. And we'll try and get as many to wrap up as we can.
Thank you. This is terrific. I'm Lindsay Coates with Interaction. My question is really informed by my personal experience. I started professional life as a civil rights lawyer in Mississippi. And when I see universality, decent work, inequality, I think rights. But when you look at the wonderful tape on the Global Goals website, and they have all these wonderful celebrities, the personalizing you were talking about, Tara, the word rights appears once. Right to healthcare. And I'm wondering if we are uncomfortable with the language of rights because it's too political. I'm just curious about your thoughts about where the intersection with rights is and why that, to me, seems absent from a lot of the public conversation.
What do you think, Amina? I mean, if you look at all of these, it looks like these are, inalienable rights that everyone should have. Good health, gender equality, clean water.
They are, absolutely. I mean, we had a long discussion through this process that it became about the words and less about what the agenda was going to deliver. And I think the fabric of this agenda is a human rights one. And at the end of the day, it's underpinned by Goal 16, which we never would have got. We had a resolution on the rule of law. We came to discuss Goal 16. It was as though we never had a resolution. So it was hard fought for across the board. It was not an agenda of the North or the South or in the middle. It was everyone. So I think that if you see on the global goals, the whole issue of whether they've got a right, they've said rights or not, I don't think that's what matters. What matters is what do we want to deliver? Do we want to get girls in school? Do we want to make sure we end child marriage and there's zero tolerance for violence against women and that you have a right to a decent job? These are all things that will come out of this agenda that will deliver on the rights agenda. The human rights framework has a number of legal instruments that will be reinforced by this agenda because it is so doable. There are practical issues there that you see that you can invest in and achieve those rights. So I'm not concerned about it because I think there was a concerted effort to make sure that that fabric that we are stitching these into was the human rights framework and the agenda.
Okay, we're going to go to this gentleman here, and then if you have a question, we're going to do a lightning round at the end. We're going to wrap up these last questions after this gentleman right here.
Thanks very much, panelists. Rajesh Merchandani from the Centre for Global Development. Does it really matter if in 15 years from now we haven't achieved all the goals?
I mean, I don't know. I'm not going to fail before I start. So I think it does matter if we don't achieve them. And I think it's really important that that's what we put the pressure on, is how to do it. These are doable. When we get them, we haven't achieved them, ask me the question.
Well, at least we'll be going as far as we possibly.
The implications for not doing a lot of this, we talk about this being the first generation that can do it and the last generation that will have a chance to bend the curve on climate change. There are implications. It's not we can't do it. It'll be more expensive. In some cases, it won't matter. It won't happen. Not just more resources, but the number of lives that will be at stake. So I think, really the urgency of it and for us all to get together, pulling in the same direction, it has to be urgent, yeah.
Okay, what we're going to do is, if you have a question, raise your hand. I think we're just going to take a few last ones in a lightning round. Right here, this sir right here, this woman right here, and in the back. And just keep your hand raised, and we're just going to do a lightning round, and then we'll ask the panelists to close up.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Sarah. I'm an graduate student at Georgetown University. Thank you for this great discussion. My question is about the refugee crisis in Europe. I can see that there's no global goal that is directing talking about this crisis, that digital media nowadays are basically showing us pictures every day. So my question is, how do you feel that those 17 global goals, which are a lot, can help solve this problem? Thank you.
Great question. Okay, right here.
Hello, so my name is Erica Rogers, and I work with a nonprofit here locally in DC called Youth for Human Rights International. So our mission is actually to educate and empower youth on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So my question to you would be, how can I help by getting youth involved? Because often I'll work with these middle school and high school students, and we'll go over the global goals, we'll go over their human rights, and afterward they really want to know what they can do as young people to make an impact.
Great. Sir, right here.
How do you keep it going after next week? When people forget about it and they're watching something else on CNN.
We love that. Okay, last questions, this gentleman right here and right there, okay? Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Blake Bolton. I work in the technology sector. We were talking a lot about sustainable development through connecting the world through technology, but what about where the raw minerals of where our technology comes from? These developing nations that tend to have really irresponsible mining practices. What happens when we reach peak rare earths and the cost of the environment from that?
Okay, let's close up with this gentleman right here.
My question is, in what way can the inclusive process that was used to design the goals be used to implement the goals?
Great question.
Not
Okay.
just asking, sorry.
Sorry. Sure. Okay, quickly. Okay, no. Okay, Tara, why don't we start with you with how do we empower youth, and also the issue of inclusiveness, how do you use it to actually implement the goals, not just spread the word about them?
So to wrap up from different questions, and they all come back to this central issue that we've talked about, but I'm going to make very concrete, and that is we live in a post-rhetoric world, by which I mean people
Really?
are no longer content, and we talk a lot. Social media, blogs, tweets, there's a lot of chat. I do think there is some impatience about, we've heard slogans, we want to see concrete deliverables. What I like about the sustainability goals is the fact that there's 17 of them, that you can pick up on 1, 3, 5,
Something
8,
for
9
everyone.
on something and take the ball and run with it. If you're a young person, I've told 3 college students in the past few months, write an op-ed. Op-eds are no longer the domain of intellectual experts only. Write something, publish it. You have the ability to self-publish anything. Secondly, find local role models, elevate them. We can't just use youth as a generic anymore. Who? Let's get these young voices out there. And the last is cooperate with one another. For a very long time, we've had multiple organizations in the same space.
Elizabeth, why don't you talk about how do we keep the interest in this next week when, you know, the tweets drop off and the talk about this drops off? How do we sustain?
Well, this
the
is to me probably the greatest vulnerability as we go forward, is that people will take their eye off the ball. They'll get distracted. The world's a complicated, tough place, and they'll forget what we just spent several years trying to launch. To me, that's actually about all of you. It's about you, and it's about how we use these tools, technologies, and basic garden variety organization to keep focused on the opportunity we've created for ourselves to deliver. And there are various tools we can use. I mean, to me, a huge part of this comes down to data. Data transparency, cumulative learning, how it is that we are accountable for performance and for delivery. That's going to be enormous. Can I just say one more thing about take the ball and run with it? The beautiful thing about these goals is that if you take the ball and run with any one of them, there's a thread that connects to the others. And people worked really hard to create that. You kind of can't get stovepiped in this framework. And that's, I think, one of the really powerful things.
Amina, we're very focused with the current refugee crisis, but every few years there's another refugee crisis, and how do improving upon these goals kind of stop the flow of refugees having to leave their home? And I mean, I think you can just touch upon how the question on minerals and just natural resources in a country play into that.
Well, the refugee crisis now is because it's happening to Europe and they suddenly can't cope with it, but actually it's a daily event for many countries. And 9,000 go across the border from Burundi into Tanzania, and they're going into Lebanon. But now they go into Europe, it's become an issue. And I think that's a good thing, because now we have to wake up and really think about the root causes and talk about the origin. If you want to stem the tide, use the SDGs to invest in that origin, the root causes of all of this. No one wants to go across the Mediterranean and perish there, or cross the desert unless they have to. This is forced. And I think that, we do have targets there for migration. Yes, the refugee crisis has come along and has compounded this. The good news is that we did have a conference of this in the GA that addressed migration. It's clearly a global issue. There are clearly issues of human rights and also ones of dealing with that root cause. So I think that this is an opportunity that we see the SDGs, again, not taking our eye off the ball, begin to use them to address the issues the crises that we see now happening. On the exploitation of natural resources, I mean, quite frankly, we have a huge discussion on where do we get the resources from? How much of these resources have actually just sort of frittered away in illicit flows, which have a lot to do with what we've been doing with our natural resources. And that's been a big discussion that happened in Addis Ababa around the framework for where we get these resources from. So I think the governance structure was also a big part of this discussion, and countries are beginning to look at that. We know that we also need capacities to deal with this, the contracts that you need to have with big multinationals, that often weak states that need these resources and perhaps don't have strong institutions of governance are exploited. It is a major part of this conversation. I think that when we look at these plans, this offers an entry point to bring these issues into it. It's not you don't have some of them, but it's actually now on the agenda. It's there on the map. The fact that we have end child marriage, it's not that we haven't been advocating for it, but it's on there as something that will be measured, that we will report on, and that will be reflected. So the same thing, I think, on the governance and the extractive industries challenge that we have. The report that came out of Africa illustrated the kind of savings that you can get if you could address it. But that's a global issue. There's one thing to take them out. It's another thing to where do they go to? There are two-way streets here: tax evasion, the tax havens that we talk about, and those illicit resources. What I will say at the end of it is that this whole process for implementation will be a concentrated effort at looking at this in three parts as we set the UN up with its three pillars for peace, for development, and human rights. We have to look at the front bit and use this agenda to really prevent any further conflict. There are many, many places that are still very fragile. You continue the inequalities and exclusion, young people will become fodder for the wrong thing. Then you have conflict, and quite frankly, there's not much we can do about that. That's a political solution that we need to find. And the end bit, which is coming out of conflict, needs the right investments in the short and the longer term, and this agenda provides it for it. And the UN really is the business of hope. It's closing that gap between what is and what should be. And that's what we have to concentrate on, close out conflict so that there is a more peaceful and prosperous world. And to do that, we need everyone. It is a global partnership. A lot of political leadership, but most of all, it's going to be about young people, because the next 15 years, this is a burden. This is a huge burden to carry, but you've got the wherewithal to do it. The energy, the vision. Hopefully, it'll be intergenerational, and you won't dump us. My children always say to me, "Well, we know what it is that you do as you know you're the Secretary General's special advisor, but what is it you do?" And that's the beginning of waking up and saying we have to explain better and include you in it. It's not about your future, it's about today. In fact, it's about yesterday, and bringing everyone in to make this work. We've got, I'm really enthusiastic about this. I go back to Nigeria in the next few weeks, and it's about taking this agenda and working with it in a really complicated country that has huge security problems with Boko Haram, that has massive governance and corruption issues, and a lack of infrastructure, very little power, very little connections with infrastructure. Can we take this agenda and make it work for Nigeria? I think we can. And that's what I'm going to do. So it's my question, as Liz said, what are you going to do?
Well, that's a great way to end it. I think that's a great way to end our discussion on having everybody think about what they're going to do We have the agenda, we have the technology, we have a voice to spread the word and to get involved. So look at one of these goals. To quote Tara and Elizabeth, take the ball and run with it. And we look forward to continuing the discussion. Thank you to the ambassador and the embassy and the UN Foundation. Thank you. Oh my God, I'm so sorry.
What?
I'm so. I'm sponsoring it now.
The show was. Thank you.